All right, here we are.
We're
Galatians chapter
back.
4. We're back. Everybody's been clamoring for us to. This is like one of those cliffhanger episodes, Judd, where you know season finale. You have to wait for a whole new season, and they don't know what to do with themselves.
That's right. That's right. We finally got filming clearance. We got our locations cleared. We're ready to go.
All right, that's enough of that. Enough of that made up stuff. We're jumping back into Galatians chapter 4 here. It's been a couple weeks, I guess, since we've been here, and I just mentioned to you, I feel like chapter 4 really is continuing in. Of course, we all know or should know that the chapter and verse divisions are not inspired scripture. They were added much later to help us find stuff. I'm thankful we have them, but they don't always indicate a major shift, right?
Right. And quite honestly, sometimes they're uninspired. Sometimes
It's kind of like
it's helpful to find things, but it maybe would be more helpful if the chapter breaks were somewhere else sometime, for the reason that very oftentimes the way that we read is, today I'm going to read chapter 2, tomorrow I'm going to read chapter 3, the next day I'm going to read chapter 4, and we segment up what really is an argument that's meant to flow together.
Right.
So we'll get a little bit of that today.
Yep, that happens. And as we jump into chapter 4, in the translation I have here, it begins with, "What I am saying is that." So it's evident that he's trying to continue on with the thought. Also, Jed, I wonder if in that there's kind of this recognition of this might not be that clear. Like this may take a couple tries to kind of, maybe not clear is the wrong, but it's deep or dense enough, right?
Sure.
But it's gonna take a couple goes to really have it sink in to our.
What's the line? I've heard it said that when you preach a sermon, you should say, "Here's what I'm going to say. Here's what I say, and here's what I just said."
Right.
And I think we get some of that with Paul. You and I slogged through Galatians 3 a little bit of, okay, I have some questions. I don't quite follow this. And if Paul realizes that as he's writing, he might say, all right, guys, here's my point. Here's what I'm trying to say.
I almost wonder too, if this is very speculative, right? But if Paul wrote this with other people around, most of his letters even name other people, perhaps even throughout the process, there's like, I don't know if they're talking through it at all, if he's saying it out loud, because if somebody else is writing it, probably as he's speaking it, maybe they're like,
is that what you meant? Because I don't know what you're talking about.
We can't erase. That'll cost us the papyrus. Plus that questions our doctrine of inspiration. But let's do it again, right? So in any case, he's going further and deeper in with this argument. So why don't you read a little bit and see where we go?
Okay. My point is this: heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they are owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And I think I'll do one or two more verses. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God.
Okay.
All right. A lot there, but I think it's helpful to...
Yeah, no, it was good to read the whole thing. There's a lot there. It's kind of, makes your head kind of go a little bit. Okay.
So I think the foundation starting piece is Paul is going to draw an analogy from the way that his world works. Yeah. And it's a way that our world mostly works or sometimes works, but we have to make sure we're on the same page with this. And specifically the idea that in a family relation or in a household, it would be the sons, and primarily the firstborn son, who would inherit the property of the father. So that all of the language that we have throughout the New Testament, when it talks about us being sons of God, and then some English translations, to help women realize, hey, this is talking to you too, will say children or sons and daughters or something like that.
Right.
All of that is good. It's helpful, but we need to almost hold in tension or hold side by side. Son equals heir. Son gets the stuff. That's what we're.
Yeah, I think that it's not as problematic, because we almost have to go back and explain the historical setting in order to explain it. Because I think in our time and place, there's not this firstborn typically gets a lion's share. I mean, in our system, we can do whatever we want with our estates. We could leave nothing to our kids. We could leave everything to our kids. But I'm not aware of too many situations where a couple or an older person has multiple kids and says, well, the first is going to get 2/3 of the estate, and then the next one's going to get 1/3. That would be very uncommon, I think, for us today. Whereas that would be the norm in the biblical world that you're referring to. In that regard. So by saying sons and daughters doesn't cause a big problem for us in our culture, but we do have to it's kind of jumping ahead of doing that work of understanding the ancient world and then jumping between the two worlds, right? To use that analogy to us today.
And sort of the whole realm that we have today of, well, Susie is a lawyer, and so she really doesn't need financial help, but George is working at McDonald's, so I'm going to give him the lion's share. That's not the way it would have worked in the old world. Firstborn gets the lion's share, and even if they're well off and their siblings are not, then a responsibility falls on the oldest to provide for their siblings, if they so choose. I mean, you get good brothers and you get bad brothers, right?
I mean, the idea in the ancient world that the inheritance also came along with responsibilities. Right. Which may or may not be interesting in this broader spiritual topic. But that wasn't just about, hey, how much cash do I get to go on vacation or buy a bigger house or whatever. It came with responsibilities for the family land, or for, as you said, taking care of younger siblings or other people that may not be in good shape. It was both privilege and responsibility, not just give me cash money, kind of deal. We also don't have slaves. Thankfully, thank God, right? I mean, not that nobody around the world does, but I think today, even this kind of slavery would be uncommon, even if you would find sort of something. But again, well understood in the world to which he was writing.
Right. So and slaves, and we have to remember this is not racial slavery, but the slavery that Paul is talking about. The slaves would be part of the household in the sense that the father would be responsible for them too. And then when the father dies, the oldest son who inherits would be responsible for everybody in the family, and that includes the slaves.
But the slave would get nothing and in the inheritance. They have no rights in that regard, but as you say, the heir has responsibility there. Right. So we're getting a little far afield, but it is helpful to understand that, I think, to understand the analogy and just to understand the ancient world a little bit better.
Right. So Paul begins in these first two verses, and he's saying, quite honestly, you can be the oldest son or the lowest slave, and you're sort of in the exact same place within the household structure. You're both beholden to the father figure, the patriarch of the household, who has all the stuff. And even if you're an heir, you don't get any of it until you actually inherit, and that's when the stuff happens.
We see that in Luke chapter 15, right? The parable of the two sons, really, and the older son who is aligned to be the primary inheritor. The father still said, and the younger son comes back, says, "Hey, kill the fattened calf, do the whatever, throw the big party." The older son will be the primary inheritor, but he's got nothing. He can't say anything about it. It's still the father. The father is still, the boss, if you will, the responsible one until the time where he dies, and that's when it shifts. So it doesn't matter how old your son, it doesn't matter if he's 50 or whatever. It's the father is in charge.
Right.
So
okay. So if I'm tracking correctly, Paul is saying that in the same way that someone could be living in the household, have the potential for all this inheritance, but hasn't actually received it yet, that was the position of the believer before Jesus came. That was the position of the believer under the law, that there's this great, enormous potential to receive, but there's a guardian or a trustee, different words are going to be used, over this person. And as we've already spelled out, in this case, the guardian was the law, that it was the placeholder. I don't know if I quite like that terminology, but
I like this analogy the more I think about it, and I may be pushing it farther than Paul entails, etc. But the reason why we don't give thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to kids is because they need guardrails, right? They're going to probably do irresponsible things with it. Sure. The goal being that as a child grows up, they become responsible, such that ultimately the father can give his heirs the estate and know that they're going to be responsible with it. Now, when they would, my understanding is when they would have an estate, they wouldn't put all kinds of particularities around here's how you must use it, heir, right? It's like you're going to be entrusted to be faithful with this. But before that, no, you need someone to supervise you because we don't want you to make dumb decisions. Here's your guardrails. And so that was okay. Again, the law is not bad. Paul wants to say that, but it's not the destination, right? It's not the ultimate intention. And so we need to be going somewhere.
I think that Paul is doing a little bit of mixed metaphor here, because he's sort of saying that, like, under the law, we, meaning believers, we're both the child or the minor and the slave.
Yeah,
and,
that is.
And so what Jesus did is like we were caught in this place where there was the potential for inheritance, but we didn't have it yet, and we were a slave, so we had no inheritance. And what Jesus does is frees us from the slavery part, makes us full children, so that now the possibility of inheritance is fully on the table for us.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to remember that the best metaphors break down. Jesus tells wonderful parables in which he uses metaphors. And if you push it too far, you say, well, that doesn't really work. It's a metaphor. Yeah. You can only do so much with it.
Yeah.
So Paul is working within this realm of the first century family, but he's also kind of letting the lines be a little porous to fit his.
Yeah, I think it tracks with, I've said in the last video, etc. I think this part of Galatians in particular is really tracking with Romans, in particular Romans chapter 7 and chapter 8. And chapter 6 and some of the previous material we looked at sort of as well. But this idea of, again, that's the material that covers a lot about the law. Is the law bad? No, the law's not bad, but sin, seizing the opportunity, right, made us a slave, enslaved us. So we're in this analogy, we're children, we should be the rightful heirs, or at least we God's people throughout the story,
right?
But because of sin, and I'm not this elemental spiritual forces. You have a different translation of this Greek word, is a little bit confusing, maybe to me. But whatever it is, we're supposed to be children, but we've actually been enslaved. So yes, he's mixing metaphors. I don't think it's accidental. I think he's intentional, with it.
Right.
But it does make it a little bit more challenging for us to navigate the double aspects of it. We do know, both in the ancient Jewish and Roman world, that, like you said, it's not just race based. Anybody could become a slave. In the Old Testament, if you had a debt you couldn't pay, you could choose to be a slave, even though you were a child. We again, back to Luke chapter 15. He says, "Hey, I'll come back and be like a slave, not an inheritor anymore."
Right.
And in the Roman world, again, if you were conquered, you were a slave, you became a slave.
Right.
So it's not, there's a lot of give and take there. So, all right, take us forward.
So this phrase in verse 3, I read elemental spirits. You have something similar to that?
Yeah, elemental spiritual forces. I pulled up the lexicon on it, and it's got a bunch of definition. The substances underlying the basic elements of the natural world. It could be celestial heavenly bodies, fundamental principles, transcendent powers that are in control over the events of this world. That's probably the definition closest to this. Some kind of power that's not aligned with God's purposes.
Right. And kind of the idea of, if we are not inheriting from God, if we are not receiving the things from him, we're going to be receiving the things from somebody else or somewhere else, and this kind of thing. Verse 4 is a wonderful place to pause. If you're ever looking to preach a Christmas message and you feel like, well, I've done the Gospels so many Christmases in a row, I need a different verse to preach Christmas from. Galatians 4:4 is Christmas. This is the coming of Jesus. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. Right. So this is what Jesus accomplished for us, is aligning us with God's kingdom purposes for us, so that we might be children, so that we might be the inheritors, so that we might be like the Father. Jesus says to the Jews, Abraham's not your father, the devil's your father. Why? Because you're acting like the devil. You act like who your father is.
Right.
And as children of God, we are to act like God. People should look at us and say, I think those are God's kids, because they're doing the things that God does. I'll often say to my kids, if we see kids out in the street doing something that they shouldn't be doing, I'll say, well, we don't do that in our family. Right. There's a way, there's something it means to be a Spencer. We act a certain, doesn't mean we get it right all the time, but this is what we're going for. In the same way, when we talk about being God's children, we do something special, or we do something specific in our family as children of God. And that's what we're being called to.
Right. Yeah. That's a big topic, and a lot of good stuff there. There's a lot, that could be sort of unpacked in there. I'm not sure the significance of born of a woman in this context, but it's beautiful and it's true,
Right. I mean, he's certainly going out of his way to hone in on the humanity of Jesus.
Yeah. But I think even more significant to the larger argument, born under the law to redeem those under the law. So Jesus joins, I don't know if it's fair to say us or not, because maybe you've got some Jewish background in yourself, but not for myself. But in any case,
right. But
actually, he says to redeem those under the law, which is really interesting, Judd. Given the audience, sort of, et cetera, and what's going on here, again, it's probably more of a rabbit trail than we need to sort of go on, because he obviously redeems us all. But is there something unique about Jesus's, accomplishment?
Well, I think he's talking historically here. He's saying, let's go back and remember what happened.
Right. Because we would not say that, hey, only certain believers are receive adoption to sonship. That's very much the opposite of what the argument of the letter is trying to make, right? Right. In that case, but it's
so that even Gentiles before Jesus, if they had said, and in some cases they did say, hey, I actually do want to follow Yahweh. How do I do this? It was become a Jew, follow the law. And so now Jesus is both redeeming those who actually are under the law, and he's also redeeming those who previously would have had to come under the law, can now go straight to Jesus, rather than.
And again, in the big picture of the argument here, we potentially have Gentiles who have responded favorably to Jesus, who are now either externally or internally, or both, being whatever to be circumcised, to follow the law. And so Paul's putting this current situation into the big picture, which is good fit for us. That's what we try to do, right? Trying to put their current situation into the big picture and say, you need to understand the big picture, or you're not going to be able to process what's in front of you right now very well, because Jesus came to redeem those under the law, that was the guardian for children. And now we're coming into adoption to sonship. You're going, they were tempted to go backwards, I think, in a strong sense, right? In the story, to jump into a part of the past that's already been worked through in the life and actions of Jesus. And so, we're starting to think as we're hearing this, well, why would I want to get circumcised then? Why would I want to do this then? Right? Because where are we at in the story? Which, Judd, is a great question as well, too, that we need to continue to think about when we quote verses of the Bible or things in the Bible. Sometimes we don't do a very good job of thinking about where we at in the story and how do we apply it to our time today. That's very much a field, but there's some subtext under that with some things.
Sure. No, absolutely.
But in any case. But yeah, I mean, this is beautiful stuff, right? He born under the law to redeem those under the law, which we connected earlier in this letter with Jesus taking the curse upon himself. That we might, but again, the purpose. So why, though, if it's the why of the gospel, why of the good news, that we might receive adoption to sonship. That's my translation here, and I think that's probably a decent translation.
Yep.
You have something similar? Yeah.
Adoption as children is what the NRSV says. So again, children is good because it lets the women know that they're involved also. Sonship is good because it's reminding us of the first century context in which the firstborn male would inherit. And so we need both of those, but to understand everybody's included and it's about inheritance.
That's always the work of translation. How much work do we do for people versus make them do, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And because we are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So I think there's probably a subtle and maybe not so subtle here dig at circumcision that Paul is reminding us about the seal of the covenant in Jesus. And it's not you've been adopted as sons, so get circumcised. It's you've been adopted as sons and you have the promise of the Holy Spirit.
We talked in an earlier video of, I think, about does baptism replace circumcision in the new covenant? And I think we argued to an extent it probably does. I think though, or wonder though, if actually it's the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that really is that covenant marker, even more so than baptism. I mean, they correspond, right? There's not a whatever, but when it's when God sends his Spirit to a Gentile like that Peter visits
with Cornelius,
right? That's the affirmation. It's not, well, he was baptized, so he must be in, right? That wasn't the argument that they made. It was God gave him the Spirit, so he should be baptized, right? He should be in. So there's an external, and then there's a
It's a both
internal in that sense. It's both and, right? But I think that's an important, an important piece of it.
Yep. So, probably worth mentioning just because it's mentioned. It's said so often. Abba is the Aramaic word for father. It can be a term of endearment, a daddy kind of thing, but it's not limited to that. I've heard too many sermons where the preacher will say, "Oh, Abba means daddy," and that means it's a little child who's coming to. It can be that word, but this is just the word for father. It's a familial word. It's a term of endearment, but we shouldn't read too much into that.
it's fascinating, and that's a good point. Yeah, because there's been whole sermons about that. They're a little, questionable, but it's fascinating that he would include an Aramaic word to a Greek-speaking audience in that regard. It's interesting thing.
Yeah.
In that regard. Do any of the Gospels transliterate that? I think they do. One of them does, at least, right? Puts Abba in there in Aramaic.
Yeah, I know that there's like whatever it is, 3 or 4 Aramaic terms that are sometimes the gospel writer will say, which means, Luke is good at making sure that his Gentile audience knows.
Understands it. Yeah, it's interesting when that's used, but I wonder if that's part of why Paul's doing that. If it shows up in gospel teaching, if it will connect to Jesus' own, that's a side thing.
Oh, you mean this word specifically?
So like you were saying, in the Gospels, which are written in the same language this is written in, which is not Aramaic, it's Koine Greek, but certain words. So like, what's the value of putting in the Aramaic word into a Greek document? Obviously, it's got some importance or significance. I think when it comes to the Gospels, the time when it's done, I suspect, and it's not originally my idea, but that there was such a power in the memory of that moment of hearing Jesus speak that word and have that powerful result of somebody who was, dead being alive again, and that just was probably sunk into their memories, and they wanted to preserve that. I don't forget where I heard that, but I find it compelling or interesting, at least.
Sure, that makes sense
in that regard, to kind of maintain that. So yeah, and then verse 7, as this little section concludes here, and so you are no longer a slave, but God's child, and since you are his child, God has also made you an heir. And I know God's is provided there in my translation, the first occurrence. But this is
here's kind of bringing the historical argument to bear on present day. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's God saved those who were under the law. It was them back then. And, already we've been struggling with, well, do we say we or do we say they? And now here's Paul bringing it and saying, so you are included in this. Right. Well, what Jesus did for them back there works through to present day for believers.
Yeah. And I think, again, I'm cross-referencing Romans chapter 1, et cetera. Even the Gentiles who were not inheritors of the law in the Old Testament sense found themselves in the same situation of being enslaved, right, by the power of sin. We're all under the power of sin just the same. We all need, whether or not it's, again, the specific law, 10 Commandments, et cetera, and the curse associated with that. We're all in this boat where we need redemption from what's made us enslaved. Jesus does that. And this just is a great affirmation. Like, some folks just need some affirmation in their lives sometimes of declaration. And again, it's not necessarily, especially if you're feeling kind of down on yourself sort of at times. Again, it's not because you did all these things or checked all these boxes or did the things perfectly correctly. It's because of what Jesus has done, right? That he's declared you are no longer a slave, but God's child, but a child, right? And an heir. Right. That's huge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, all right, let's do at least the next paragraph or so. What do you think?
Okay.
Or are you feeling done?
Nope. I thought we would wrap it up early, but if you got time for a few more verses.
Let's do 4 through 11.
Okay.
Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who were by nature are not gods. So, are the whole thing?
Those are those spirits.
But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, I love that too. How is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. Oh. Judd, verse 11 will be a great call to worship on Sunday. Would that be great?
Well, in all seriousness, there's there's something astonishing, in sort of the scope of salvation and the theological discussions that we have of, Paul has some pretty strong statements in Galatians where he's clearly using hyperbole. Is this one of them? Or is he making a theological statement? Listen, I came, I did a lot of work. We started a church. There were clearly believers. There was the work of the Spirit. All these good things were happening. You followed the gospel. And now it actually turns out that I wasted all my time because you've gone right back to where you were,
Yeah.
I
think it's a legitimate, I think it's a real emotion that he's feeling. I don't think it's just whatever, but in any case, though, it does have the rhetorical effect of, this is really serious.
Yeah.
Like, this is not something that I'm just like, yeah, I'm in a different place than you guys on this. If you could just get realigned, that would be great. But if not, no big deal. It's like, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
This is a big deal to him. It's hard. You can't walk away from it and say that, right? That it's not important.
Yeah. And these rudimentary spirits, these worldly spirits, and I think you used the word miserable. I like that. The NRSV has beggarly, which I think is actually, it's a weird word, but I think it's actually a pretty good translation for.
So the forced is the same word that those 2 or 3 words are used up in the above section.
Yeah.
So the element, in my translation, the elemental spiritual forces, that's all one word in Greek. And it's the same word for just the forces there. And again, I'm working with the NIV, or working with the NRSV, but then this word for miserable is a different word. Yeah. To be economically disadvantaged, to be thrust on divine, to be poor, lacking in spiritual worth. I'm just reading through the lexicon here quickly.
Sure.
To be extremely inferior in quality. Miserable, shabby.
and there's
beggarly forces. That's like a King James holdover.
Yeah. But I think there's some power in using sort of an economic term here. You're impoverishing yourself. The Father is offering you the fullness of the inheritance, and you're going next door to the pauper who has nothing to offer you. You're it's miserable. It's beggarly. Mm-hmm. These alternative sources of revenue, spiritual revenue.
Do you think he's turning in verse 8 here? Do you think he's now specifically more on a Gentile, like turning his audience more to this attention, more to the specific, rather than telling the whole Old Testament story? Like, I guess here's the question: would Paul say of Jewish background folks who haven't responded to Jesus yet, you did not know God, you never knew God? I don't know. Maybe he would say that. It's a question mark to me.
It's really interesting. I'm not going to be able to pull out now where it is, but there's a time in which Paul is talking. I think it's about his own actions before he met Jesus. Maybe he's talking about the Jews in general. I can't remember. But he uses the term unbelief. He says they were acting in unbelief. Yeah. And it's this really interesting. Does he mean, well, they didn't have the fullness of revelation of Jesus Christ, or did they mean didn't believe in Yahweh? And I don't think he would state it that strongly, because clearly he has very positive things to say about Jews who were inheritors of the law, inheritors of God's word, and inheritors of the patriarchs and the promises and all of this. But there is this sense of, to persist in partial revelation when God has given a fuller revelation is to be in unbelief, or to persist in unbelief.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, that's a broader question. The more specific question is what's going on right here. I suspect he's trying to cast the net wide in saying, and again, it's not spelled out here as much as it is in Romans, course, Galatians and Romans were also not written on the same at the same time, right? Galatians, by most accounts, written very early, perhaps Paul's earliest or one of the earliest letters that he wrote. Romans, quite some time later.
Yep.
That would get from a human perspective, would have given some time to kind of further flesh out, or just space. Maybe just, you need to explain himself more. This is kind of like an urgent response letter. Like this is triage here. Romans is more, let me lay out the big picture, right? So there's more time and space there in that regard. But I think perhaps what's going on here is under the law, again, gave opportunity for enslavement to these spiritual forces for God's people, Israelites. Gentiles also are under the power of sin and are enslaved, whether or not they knew or ever had the law. It's the same. We're in the same place, no matter how we got there, but everybody's there.
Right.
And so why would you, so if we're talking specifically about Gentiles here who are not inheritors of the law, they didn't know the 10 Commandments and sort of all that, but they're enslaved. They were enslaved under the power of sin. But God's people, Old Testament people, Israelites, were also enslaved under the power of sin, even though they had the law. So why now, having been set free from all that, would you go back to something, whether it was you or some other people that were in a situation that put them under slavery to this power? Why would you want to go back to that situation?
Right.
I think that's the connection and I think no matter how you hash that out, it gets you to the same place.
Right. For sure.
But I don't necessarily think he's telling the Gentiles, hey, you were under the law in the Deuteronomic sense of all that. But maybe,
Right.
So like for example, when we get to it's interesting when we get to verse 10, and this is kind of a subject of, I guess, some debate. I'm not freshened up on it recently. You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. What's he referring to there? Right? Is this the Jewish calendar? Is it something else? I'm not sure. It seems, I think it's possible or maybe likely that it is the Jewish calendar, but I don't. It's hard for me to believe. And maybe it is the case. It's just hard for me to believe. But it's hard for me to believe that Paul would expect Jewish followers of the Messiah to totally abandon all of that.
Right. And my hunch would be that it's less about are you celebrating the festivals or not, and more about what is your motivation in celebrating the festivals.
Right.
Even under the law, God says multiple times to Israel, stop celebrating the festivals. I don't want you to bring me any sacrifices. Stop doing it. Right. And it has nothing to do with
because of where they were at with their hypocrisy, etc. Not because I don't want festivals anymore.
Exactly. So it's not I'm changing my mind about the law, but it's if you are doing this just to go through the motions, or if you're doing this and then you're going right back to what you were doing anyways, I'm not interested. You're not bringing anything to the table. In the same way, if you're celebrating the festivals as a workaround to Jesus or workaround instead of Jesus, God is going to save me because I'm doing all these things, or this is what's going to bring. Now I'm interested in that phase.
I think Paul sees more than they see. I don't get the impression that anybody's saying we don't need Jesus here. We just need to get circumcised and follow the festivals. I think, if the primary idea either by themselves or oftentimes by external people is, okay, great. Now, because God sent the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, and yes, he's inviting everybody in, he's inviting everybody to become Jewish. Right. And so we're going to respond to the Messiah, Jesus, but we're all going to get circumcised. We're all going to follow the calendar. We're all going to do this as part of it. So it's like in a sense of Jesus plus, that's the problem, not instead of Jesus. It would be my, I guess, thought about it. Jesus plus these things makes you right with God. Not, I think what Paul is saying is Jesus, like Jesus, period. And they would be, I don't know. You're giving me
the only reason I'm pausing. I'm going back to chapter 1, verse 6, I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but some are confusing and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So is the quote unquote other gospel a Jesus plus gospel, or is it a something instead of Jesus gospel? And
that is a good question.
And I think it could almost be a everyone's sort of doing it their own way. Some of the people are trying to say, "Oh, I don't need Jesus because I have the festivals." Others are saying, "Oh no, we love Jesus. We just love the festivals too, and so we need that both." And it probably was less a fully worked out ecclesiology or theology. It was just a, hey, here's the ways that we're trying to do it, and Paul's trying to cut through all of that and take them directly to the cross and directly to what Jesus did.
Yeah, I mean, my strong suspicion is that they very much did not see the problem anywhere near the way that Paul does, and this may even have been news to them in a sense. Again, sometimes we communicate things like this. We say like this should be obvious, right? Or something like that. But it's not, and we often tend towards syncretism in some
Sure.
senses.
And I think the argument for that is when we get into chapter 2 and Peter refuses to eat with the Gentiles. None of us would say, oh, here is Peter rejecting Jesus and saying, I'm going to be right with God by not eating with Gentiles. Peter is still fully on board with Jesus, but he's mixing in these other elements that are causing problems.
Yeah, and the other people that come that lead him to that in that chapter are obviously Jesus people too. I mean, they're coming from James, from Jerusalem, from the church kind of hub. Right. So I don't think they're coming and saying, "Hey, forget about Jesus. Let's just do the law thing." I'm really going to stick with my Jesus plus the law being the problem. And I think what Paul is saying here is not new, but Jesus, when you get Jesus plus the law, you miss Jesus, right? Like it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. We don't get to pick and choose. It's not a choose your own adventure. It's not kind of do a mashup of kind of however you want it to be, and that's going to be fine, sort of deal. So, okay. Anything else in this?
What about verse 9? What do you want to say about come to know God, or rather to be known by God? That's such a powerful statement.
It is powerful. It almost seems like, and again, I don't know how much people are thinking this, like in the back of their minds, like how does the doctrine of inspiration work, sort of in this. I tend to have I don't have a dictation theory where it's kind of Paul just kind of was the puppet through which Paul sort of wrote, but being continually led by and inspired by God's Spirit throughout this process, I almost wonder if he pens the words or he says the words for the scribe, and then just thinks like there's a deeper way to say this actually.
Yeah.
Remember what he says? And I worked harder than anyone, not I, but the grace of God in me. Like I don't know, like did he have? He may have had that all planned out from the front end, but he also may have said it and then just needed to, like, it's this constant, like, there is this reality, but then there's a deeper reality. And I don't want to miss that deeper reality behind everything that's going on here. And so I think perhaps he's just being inspired to continually go there, like to go like that, God is one thing, but that God knows you. Yeah. That's something deeper. Right. We can say,
there's almost a 1 John, we love because he first loved us mindset here of we do all these things and we need to do all these things and we need to focus on us in all these ways. Why? Because of what God did first and primarily and continues to do the heavy lifting.
And it's a bigger, I think, whether this works really well or not, a good touchdown. Like, so you're really into baseball, right? You probably know many, many, many baseball players, and probably not many, many Major League Baseball players know you. Maybe a few do, right? But it's different if you walk, if you walk through somewhere and you say, "Oh, I know, look at that, kids, look at that guy," and then he's like, "Okay, I'll sign. Who should I write it to?" But it'd be something else if that picture said, "Oh, hey, Judd."
Right.
Again, that
I love it.
is not God, but it's like somebody who's in some kind of a different position knows you. That would be like, people would be like, "Whoa, that guy knows who Judd is." And to magnify that, right? This is God. This is the God of the universe saying, "I know Judd's name. I know him. Not that he can name my name, but that I can name his name." Like that's getting deep.
Here. That's a special relationship,
I think, in that, and I like that.
Yep.
So how? And then there's a question, right? So how is it that you are turning back to these weak and miserable forces? Right? You're going backwards. Who wants to be a slave when you can be the heir? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So, and again, I don't think they got this until hopefully then they got it, afterwards. But it's sort of like sometimes things aren't obvious to us as they should be.
Sure.
So yeah, and then I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. I love. There's just so much more to go, and this next section that we're going to look at, I do want to wrap up here. This next section gets very direct and even personal. So we'll cover that. We'll cover that next time.
Yep.
Some good deep stuff in there. So, all right, folks, if you have thoughts or questions, please leave them. I'm enjoying this journey. There's a lot to explore here, and it's fun to do so. So if there's something that you're not clicking with, it's not making sense to you, if you just want to jump into affirm that when Judd and I disagree, you agree with me, you're welcome to do that.
Unlikely.
Especially if it's Linda, because I don't know that your mom's ever going to pick me over you, Judd, but vice versa. So
right.
Just how it's going to be. So, all right, folks, we'll catch you next time.
All right, have a good afternoon.
Bye.